wherever you're tuning in, whether you're here in the room or you're watching online live or later on, I want to tell you how wonderful it is for us to be learning together, paying attention to what God is saying to us through the Holy Spirit, through the stories of the Bible, and through the community that we share here at Heritage. I want you to be a part of that and not to miss out. I was having a conversation a couple of weeks back, talking to my son about what his 9th grade year might look like this year. And I started telling him some of the things that I can remember about my own freshman year, and we ended up talking about my 9th grade English class, and specifically the books that we had to read for my 9th grade English class. Now, I don't know how much you remember about your high school language arts classes, but I remember that 9th grade English for me was frustrating. It was really, really frustrating for me, and it wasn't the teacher's fault. I had this energetic teacher, and she tried really hard. She did the best she could. But the reason that I loathed my 9th grade English class was because I was expected to read these classic works of literature. You know what I mean? Books that I found to be incredibly hard to understand, and as a result, I found them to be incredibly boring to read. Now, I tried to read the books. I tried to wade my way through these things. I finished them cover to cover and had no idea what I had just read. Has this ever happened to any one of you before? I struggled to fathom what was even happening in the stories, and so when the teacher asked us questions about the themes of the book or about the literary elements that she had noticed and the iambic pentameter and all of that kind of stuff, I was totally lost. And so I just had to depend on the in-class conversations and the little Cliff's Notes books that I could buy at Walden Books, way before the internet could give you a summary of these things, you know. I had to depend on those to be able to scrape by in that class, but I never really picked up on the messages that those books were trying to communicate. And I've noticed that reading the Bible can create a similar struggle for a lot of modern readers. I was having a hard time in my 9th grade English class understanding novels that were written in English less than 150 years ago. And when we pick up the Bible and try to read it together, we're reading stories that were written in ancient languages that are no longer spoken, like ancient Hebrew and Koine Greek, and they were written on the other side of the world over 1,900 years ago, some of them 3,500 years ago. And so reading through the library of the Bible, it can be challenging, even for people who are avid readers. And it can be difficult enough to figure out the narrative of the story, to even imagine for yourself what's going on in the story. And so understanding the underlying message that the Bible is trying to teach us can be an exceptional challenge, which is why it's so important for us to do this together. It's so important for us to go through these texts and to imagine these stories together as a community. And that's why this summer at Heritage, we've been re-examining some of the ancient stories from the Old Testament of the Bible, stories that maybe you've never heard, or some of you, maybe you haven't heard these stories in quite some time. In fact, we've called this series Flannelgraph Favorites because many of us who grew up going to Sunday school saw these stories told using this incredible visual aid called the flannel graph. Now, some of you have never seen that before, and that's okay, but the flannel graph is just a piece of board that's covered in felt material, and you can stick these little figurines up to it, and you can use it to illustrate and tell a story, okay? And so many of us that grew up in Sunday school, we saw this visual aid being used to tell us these stories from the Bible, and it was an incredible tool. But when you learn these stories on the flannel graph, usually as a young child, there are parts of these stories that you can't make sense of just yet. And there's parts of these stories that the flannel graph teachers ought to leave out until you're older. And so today we're kicking off a 2-part mini-series about a particularly problematic section of Scripture, a section of Scripture that's full of issues and raises lots of theological questions when you read them through an adult lens and when you think about them with an adult perspective. This is too much for us to cover in just 1 week, so I'm going to encourage you to come back and tune in with us again next week. But we're going to approach the first half of this story together today, and it begins in the Old Testament book of Joshua, chapter 2. If you got a Bible with you and you want to join in, we've got this linked in the Heritage app, and you can join in using the Bible app on your phone. But all summer, what's been happening is we've been studying some of these stories, and we've been moving in chronological order. Now, we haven't stopped everywhere. We haven't covered every story along the way. We're not reading the entire Old Testament straight through. So we've bounced along, but we have gone in a timeline. We've moved in chronological order together. And so for the last 3 weeks, we've studied stories that are connected to the Exodus, this great narrative, this epic story when God freed the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and led them through the desert wilderness toward the land that God had promised to give them. And so by the time we get to the book of Joshua, the people of Israel are right on the brink of making that final step, moving through the Jordan River into the promised land. Moses has died, their leader that God had appointed. He's passed away, and Joshua, his successor, has taken up the mantle of leadership, and he's preparing to lead these people into their new homeland. And it's an exciting time, but there is one sticking point, because the promised land is not just sitting there empty, waiting on them to show up. The promised land is full of people, full of different tribes, different nations, and little cities and states and villages. It's full of all of these little mini kingdoms of people known as the Canaanites in general. And these people are not scouting for new neighbors. They're not hoping for somebody else to come and encroach on their territory. And so the big drama in this book, the drama in the book of Joshua, is about how God is going to work out this problem of proximity. And we've already been reminded this morning that God promised to give this land to the Israelites, but it's also important for you to understand that God was determined to rid the promised land of the wickedness of its current inhabitants. You see, the Canaanites were known for their moral corruption. In addition to their deviant sexual behavior and their social injustices, the Canaanites worshiped idols that demanded the sacrifice of children to their false gods. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 9, way back, just a couple of books back, Moses explained this to the Israelites. He said, "Be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire. He will destroy them," these people. "He will subdue them before you, and you will drive them out and annihilate them quickly as the Lord has promised you. After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, don't say to yourself, 'The Lord's brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness.'" He says, don't think that you earned all of this. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It's not because of your righteousness, verse 5 says. It's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going in to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so these verses are explaining, making it clear that God is preparing to carry out a judgment against the Canaanites for their wicked ways. But God is also in the process of clearing the way so that the Israelites won't be contaminated by Canaanite culture when they move into the land. They won't be contaminated by neighbors who are involved in such wicked practices. And all of that background brings us to Joshua chapter 2 and the unique story of a woman named Rahab. As the chapter begins, Joshua sends out 2 spies ahead of the Israelites so they can go and scout out the city of Jericho, a city that's fortified with walls all around it to protect it from invaders. This is going to be the first city that the Israelites are going to encounter in their journey into the Promised Land. And in the first verse, we find out that the 2 spies went to Jericho and they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. And I got to tell you, the story doesn't tell us about why they went to a prostitute's house. In fact, there's been a lot of speculation about this from scholars over time. Maybe they thought that a place like that was somewhere where they could just show up and disappear without raising any suspicions from the authorities, or maybe there was something else. Maybe there was a more carnal reason. We don't know, but what we do know is that Rahab saw an opportunity to change her own fortunes, to change her own future. Because here in a little bit, when the king of Jericho heard the rumor about these strange men who had shown up, coming from the direction where the Israelite camp was, and when the king of Jericho sent deputies to try to capture these spies and figure out what they were up to, Rahab lied to the deputies. Rahab said, "Oh, I saw them, but they've already left. They came here, but now they're gone." When in reality, they were still in her home. They were up on the roof of her home, hiding under some of the material that she used for weaving and sewing. And after the soldiers left, gone on the wild goose chase that Rahab sent them on, when she said, "I think they went that way," after the soldiers left, Rahab went up to the roof and she spoke to the 2 Israelite spies herself. And here's what she said. I want you to capture her words. I am forgetting, by the way, to put all of this up on the flannelgraph for you, and I know those of you watching at home are going to miss out on that, so I'm sorry. But you got the walled city of Jericho, and here's Rahab speaking to the spies, and here's what she says. She says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard about how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. And we have heard about what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan River, whom you completely destroyed." And she's going to keep talking here. She's going to keep explaining. In fact, this ends up being one of the longest uninterrupted statements from a woman in any story in all of the Bible. It's really important, but it's also a profound statement of conviction. You see, Rahab begins by explaining how terrified everybody in Jericho and the surrounding region has become because they've heard about all of the ways that God has been protecting and defending the Israelites. And then she says this, verse 11, she says, "When we heard it, our hearts melted in fear and everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven and above and on the earth below." And this is not a statement that Canaanite people typically make. This doesn't fit their worldview. This doesn't fit their understanding about how things work in the spiritual realm. But when Rahab says this, she's revealing that she has become convinced by the evidence of something she never understood before. She's explaining that she has become convinced of the supremacy of the God of the Israelites. Rahab has become a believer, a convert, and believes in Yahweh. And she's decided something for herself. She's decided now that she would rather entrust her future to this unknown God of these spies that she's hiding than to continue to trust in the gods that her people have been worshiping. And so she asks these Israelite spies for a favor. In fact, she asks them for a promise. She says in verse 12, she says, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign, she says, that you'll spare the lives of my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters and everybody who belongs to all of them, all of the people in their households, and that you will save us from death. Rahab is putting it all on the line here. I mean, she's making a bold request, and she's asking for their protection during an invasion that she knows is surely coming soon, and these spies agree to her request. They promise that if she doesn't tell the Jericho authorities about them, they will make sure that her life and the lives of her mother and father and her brothers and her sisters and everybody that's a part of their households too, everybody who's inside her home when the Israelites show up to attack. They say, if you'll make sure everybody's in this house, we'll make sure that they're safe. And after she receives that promise, after she confirms that deal, Rahab helps the spies escape the city through her window, which is on one of the outer walls of the city of Jericho, lowers them down, and they go back and they give their positive report to Joshua, who's awaiting their return. Now, next Sunday, we're going to do a deeper dive on Joshua chapter 6, and we're going to talk about that battle, and we're going to talk about the fall of Jericho. But what I want to tell you right now about it is that in the middle of all of that chaos, in the middle of all of that miraculous narrative, there's these verses. In Joshua chapter 6, 22 and following, Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." And so the young men who had done the spying went in, and they brought out Rahab, and they brought out her father, and they brought out her mother, and they brought out her brothers, and they brought out her sisters, and they brought out everybody who belonged to all of them. They brought out her entire family, and they put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. They set up a spot for them at the encampment where the Israelites were. And verse 25 says, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now, don't read that with any kind of magic in it. The writer of this text lived all those thousands of years ago too. And this is the last time that Rahab's name is mentioned in the entire book of Joshua. This is the last time that that narrative comes up, and it would be easy to just skip right over that and to think about all of the continuing action in the Israelite military campaign. But her story is important to the theme of this entire book. You see, the book of Joshua has a theme to it. And this is the kind of thing that I always struggled to find when I was in that 9th grade English class. You know, you're reading through all of these difficult and challenging stories, and it's in these ancient languages and written with thousands of years ago by people with a totally different worldview. And you're reading through this book of Joshua, and sometimes it's hard to pick out what the themes are and what the literary devices and elements are that the scholars would notice. But the book of Joshua has this theme about it. And the book of Joshua is all about challenging people to decide who they're going to serve. Perhaps the most recognizable set of verses in the entire book comes from Joshua 24, many chapters later, where Joshua challenges the Israelites to consider everything that they've seen God do, everything that they've witnessed from God, and make a decision about who gets their allegiance. Those verses say, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods that your ancestors worshipped before Egyptian slavery beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt. Throw away those gods and serve Yahweh, serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves." Some of your translations say, "Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in the land where you're living right now. But as for me and my household," and some of you have this verse like plastered up on the wall someplace in your home, right? Like you've got an embroidery piece that says this: "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And this is the theme of the book of Joshua, is that Joshua has waited until the end of this book, the end of this story, to issue this challenge. And the challenge comes at the end of Joshua's life, and it comes at the end of this long Exodus chapter in Israel's history, where they've had decades of witnessing what God has done among them. This moment, Joshua 24, it's the culmination of their decades-long journey after being rescued from Egypt. And Joshua challenges these people, says, think about everything you've seen. Think about what you've witnessed. Reflect on what you have been witness to, every adversity that God has carried us through, every miracle that you have seen, every story that was passed down from your parents and your grandparents. Think about all of that, Joshua says, and then make your choice. Think about everything you've witnessed and then decide for yourselves. Choose this day whom you are going to serve. What did Bob Dylan say? You got to serve somebody, right? No matter who you are, you got to decide, and you're going to serve somebody. And this is what Joshua is up to. And all of this challenge to the people, with all of their experience and all of their background and all of the moments and stories that they've had with God, all of this stands in sharp contrast to Rahab's situation. Because Rahab hadn't seen any of it. Rahab hadn't witnessed a thing. She's heard rumors. She's heard people talking in the street about something that happened decades ago, like 40 years ago, about God parting the Red Sea for this group of slaves from Egypt to walk through. She's heard rumors about some battles that happened way over on the other side of the river. She's heard secrets being exchanged on the street about some of the supposed things that this God has accomplished, but she wasn't an eyewitness to any part of it. She didn't know what manna tasted like. She never had the quail. She never drank the water that was gushing out of the rock. She had only heard about some of God's mighty acts, but when she did, she recognized the emptiness of everything she knew before. She recognized the emptiness of her old religion. She saw that the worldview that she had inherited, what had been passed down to her, was a dead-end road. And so she says, I'm not going that way anymore. And she makes this bold decision. In her heart, she settled on who she wanted to follow. She said, I know that the Lord, your God, is the King of heaven and the King of the earth. And so she courageously asks these two spies, is there room for me? Is there room for me and my people? Is there room for me and my mom and dad, my brothers and sisters and all of their kids? Is there room for my family to come be a part of what God's doing with your family? And she decided that day, I'm not going to obey the king of Jericho anymore. And she decided that day, I'm not going to worship the gods of these other Canaanites anymore. And for that, Rahab gets remembered as a person of great faith. In fact, for the rest of Christian history, if you turn to the very end of your Bible and find your way to the book of Hebrews, there's this chapter in there that's devoted to telling the stories of Old Testament characters who had great faith. You read through Hebrews chapter 11, you're not going to find Joshua's name mentioned anywhere in that chapter, but verse 31 says, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Our Christian tradition says this was a woman who discovered great faith in God. And it's important and it's inspiring for us to recognize that God accepts people whose past and whose background make them seem unworthy. I know you've heard the song Amazing Grace before. Maybe you've heard it at a funeral, or maybe you sang it 1,000 times here in this very room. But I wonder if you know the story of John Newton, the man who wrote that song, Amazing Grace. The story of John Newton, who spent his adult life working as a slave trader, going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, capturing people, stealing their freedom, and bringing them to this side of the ocean and selling them into slavery. I wonder if you know the story of John Newton, who, after living that life of carelessness about the humanity of others, that life of cruelty, that life where he bragged about how he didn't just live it up in sin, but he invited others to do that with him. One night his ship was going through a storm that scared him so bad that he decided he could no longer go through this life ignoring God's plan for him, ignoring God's goodness. He could no longer go through this life pretending that he was the captain of his own ship. And so he gave his life to the Lord, and not long after that, he wrote these words. He said, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." What's it say next? That saved a wretch like me. Right? You got to come to terms with who you really are. You got to come to terms with what you are really bringing to the table, and then realize how significant it is that God would make a place in the camp for you. You got to figure out what a wretch you are if you're ever going to be amazed by the grace of God, right? This is an important moment in the spiritual journey. And what we learn from Rahab is that even if you formerly worshiped other gods, Yahweh is ready to receive you. Even if your history doesn't look godly at all, Yahweh is standing there ready to welcome you into his family. And in a sense, we're all a little bit like that, right? In a sense, we're all a little bit like Rahab. In a sense, we're all living in the walls of a spiritual Jericho and trying to decide, who are we really going to serve? And you got to serve somebody. In a sense, we're all a little bit like that, answering this question, am I going to open my heart to the Lord based on the evidence that I've heard, based on the evidence that I've seen? Am I going to trust this invisible God to save my soul? In a sense, that's all of our story. But we can't just read this story and learn from Rahab. Because one of the most important principles we keep repeating in this series is that when we read these Old Testament stories together, we don't just look at what the people are doing. We don't read this so that Rahab or Joshua or the spies can just be our moral example. We are reading these ancient stories together, trying to train ourselves to pay attention to what God is doing. And this is one of those moments, my English teacher always used to do this, where because she understood the broader scope of the book, because she understood the big message and the themes that the author was trying to communicate, she could point to something that happened on page 4 and then point to something that happened on page 400 and show me how they were connected, right? I never was very good at doing that when I was in high school English. But in the Bible, if we keep reading and we read all of these books together and we look at the bigger story and the bigger picture of what God's up to, what we find out is that God did something with Rahab's yes that changed the history of the world. In fact, if you turn to the very first book of the New Testament, the book of Matthew, the first of these retellings, these accounts of the life of Jesus, Matthew starts with a genealogy, a family tree, because he wants his readers to understand that Jesus comes through the right lineage, from the right ancestry, from the right family line. He wants his readers to understand that Jesus could actually be the Messiah because he checks all the boxes. He meets all the requirements of the prophecies of what the Messiah would look like. And here's how Matthew begins He says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And people usually skip over this part because it's really just a list of names. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And Perez, the father of Hezron. And Hezron was the father of Ram. And Ram was the father of Amminadab. And you see why sometimes people skip over this stuff. But verse 4 says Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. And Nahshon was the father of Salmon. And Salmon, who was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. And if you're familiar with your Old Testament, you've heard that name Boaz before too. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, and Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. And it's like God was doing something. It's like God was able to take a story that didn't have any obvious value to the story of the Israelites. And God was able to weave it in a way that honors Rahab's yes. You know, throughout this series, every single week as we've gone along, I know if you've been with us multiple weeks, you've gotten tired of me explaining what a flannel graph is, right? Like, how many times can I tell you it's a piece of board covered with felt and you stick characters to it? I get it. If you've been here every week, you know what a flannel graph is if you didn't know already, okay? I'm not doing that for you. I'm telling that again every week because I realize not everybody in the room has the same history that I do. Not everybody in the room has the same story and the same experience, and not everybody in the room has seen a lesson presented on a flannel graph before, and so it may be your first week here, and if it is, I don't want you to be feeling like you're behind or you're out of the loop or unaware of what we're talking about. And so every time we talk about this series, I reintroduce what a flannel graph is. It's nothing to be ashamed of if you didn't know. But have you ever noticed that sometimes when we compare our own spiritual story to somebody else's spiritual story, we can start to feel inadequate? Have you ever noticed that sometimes when you think about what your life of faith looks like, and you hear about somebody else's testimony, somebody that had this big story that got videoed and put on YouTube or put on the screen up at church, you hear somebody else's story of all of the stuff that God's brought them through, and you think, mine's kind of boring. Sometimes you hear somebody else's story and you can feel inadequate. When I was 16 years old, there was a man that found his way to faith in our church. He was 50, and he had lived a life that looked a lot like Rahab's, actually. He had lived a life where he had run as far in the opposite direction of God's plan for his life as possible. And then when God got his attention, when God helped him to get clean, when God helped him to separate from the relationships in his life that were damaging to him and that were threatening his longevity, when God helped him to move past all of the hurts and the habits and the hang-ups that had become big problems for him, boy, he had a story. He had a story of coming rushing back to God and how God had changed everything in his life. And he could look back on the decades of his teenage years and his 20s and his 30s and his 40s and think, if God had not intervened, there's no way that I would have been here. And I heard that guy tell his story. His name was Patrick. I heard that guy tell his story in front of a bunch of different church contexts. And one night I asked him, I said, Patrick, I said, I've grown up in church. I said, I've never known what it was like to not know who Jesus is. Never, not for one moment in my life have I ever experienced obliviousness to God's will. Now, I've done wrong. I'm not saying I'm perfect. I've ignored God's will before, but I've always known what it was. I've always understood who God was calling me to be. And I said, Patrick, I'm kind of I'm a little bit jealous of your story, not because of the things that you did, but because of what you've seen God do in your life. I said, it's like you've seen God take you from a negative 100 to a positive 100, and I've watched God like move me like this, little increments. I said, I feel like my story's kind of inadequate. And Patrick looked at me and he said, Brock, he said, your story about how God has been faithful in your life from the very beginning, he said, Brock, your story inspires faith in me about what God could do with my children and my grandchildren. He says, your story gives me hope. Your story gives me faith. And it totally changed the way that I understood my own narrative with God. And what I was learning from Patrick, and what I think we can learn from Rahab, is that there is no story that God can't take and turn it into something life and world changing. There is no story that God can't use. And you don't have to have a history with God in order to have a future with God. There's no story that God can't take and use it to enact his plan and to change the world. And Rahab's story reminds us that every great spiritual story begins by saying yes to God. Every great spiritual story begins by saying yes to God and then letting God lead from there. It's your story. It's my story. Some of us have figured this out long ago, and we've been making every attempt to try to let God take the lead. And there's moments when it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back for us, but we know that that's what God has in mind. We know that God is asking for the lead role in our story. Some of you, you're just beginning to realize, just beginning to understand that your story and God's story have the possibility of being intertwined, of being woven together, but it begins with you saying yes. Some of you, this is the first time you're starting to figure that out in your life. And I want to tell you that even if you don't have a history with God, God's promise is that you can have a future with him. And that's the story of Rahab. And Rahab's story went on to change the history of Israel as she became one of the great-great-great-grandmothers of King David and one of the great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the story of Rahab, who after a life of being ignorant about God, rebellious toward God, far from God, heard about what God has done and what God is doing and what God was going to do. And she said, I want to be a part of that. And she said, yes. And from then on, her entire spiritual journey was changed. I want that for you.